I've talked before about cross-contour hatching, or shading, basically using the surface of the object itself to dictate how you put a mark on there, specifically when you're working with ink. Though to be fair, I use this when I'm working with paints and even digitally as well. In this video, we're going to be talking about what that actually looks like. Not just how to decide where your marks go, but what those marks actually say about the object that you're working on. I'm going to start with three large stones, boulders really, as we'll find out by the third one, and think about what the hatching marks on these objects, what the cross-contour shading actually says about where the object is, how it functions. I'm starting very simply with some lines that are wrapping around the object, and then I'm going to jump on and sketch out the next two objects as well. On that first one, the lines tell us that the object is below our point of view. So once we put a horizon line on this, the horizon line will actually be above the object. If you want to simulate this, grab an apple or some spherical thing and hold it in your hand below your eyes. You can see the top of the object. In the second one, you are looking straight at it. That line in the middle is the center point of the object. And on the third one, it is above your field of view, as if you were standing below it. You can see here, I'm actually putting on horizon lines, where if you are familiar with perspective drawing at all, you understand this tells us a significant amount about each piece that we're looking at. In general though, an object below the horizon line we can see the top of. An object on the horizon line we can't see the top or bottom, and an object above the horizon line we can see the bottom of. You can think of this if you were looking at a giant pumpkin. It was so massive that you couldn't see the top of it, but obviously since you are standing 4, 5, or 6 feet off the ground, you can't see the bottom of it either. In this situation, knowing how our object is positioned in space, we are going to be able to actually make some determinations about how we can shade this, how the cross-contour lines are going to be beneficial to us and tell us more about that object. In fact, when this is done well, you don't need a horizon line. You don't need a character proxy like this little one I'm putting down here to understand the viewpoint perspective of the image. Now, I find these little environmental details fun. They give it a little bit more character, but they are absolutely not necessary. I'm finally back to our first object, and I'm starting from the side. You can see I'm following these lines that curve around the object. Because our horizon line is nearer to the top of the object, the lines moving around it are going to be closer to horizontal. The further we get down the object, the more extreme those curves are going to be. This is how things actually function in our reality. If you were to take an object that actually has lines like this on it and hold it at different angles, you would see this for yourself. If you're curious about this, take a paper towel tube or a wrapping paper tube and draw lines around it, then hold it at different angles. And you'll notice that the lines appear to be different depending on where your perspective is. Moving on to the second object, these lines are actually going to change significantly as they move across its surface. For example, in the middle of this object, the lines will be nearly straight, because they actually are from our perspective. We are seeing the center of that object from our stance. That's where our eyes are striking it. So of course the lines below that are curving away from us, and the lines above that are also curving away from us in the opposite direction. Understanding this element allows you, without a horizon line, to have a firmer understanding of the object and how it exists in space. This is one of the powerful pieces of working with hatching and cross-contour shading in any way. Ink obviously works really well because we're using lots of individual marks to do this, but this can be done in other fashions as well. In fact, striations and rocks will often naturally mirror these. This final object is seen from the perspective of someone who is nearly on the ground, looking up at this massive stone. In order to make the perspective on this look correct, all of the lines will move at a more extreme slope the further up the object they go. This would be absurd, but you could continue this far into the atmosphere, and eventually those lines would be ludicrously sloped. But for our purposes here, this works just fine. But you can see that the hatching, the way that the lines are moving across this form, are dictated entirely by the surface of the object and the perspective that it is being viewed from. These are very important things. When you throw objects into a drawing, into a composition, each one of them can be thrown in with a certain sense of planning and thought. They can be haphazardly thrown in there. In fact, if you go out into nature and you just work on drawing the landscape, it is conceivably haphazardly put together. But when you are assembling a composition or an image, you have control of these features, and you can decide how they come out. So I would encourage you to practice several of these drawings, perhaps even different shapes, not all just semicircular boulders. Practice what these things are going to look like at different angles, if they're above you, if they're parallel with your vision, or if they're below your field of vision. This is something that I will keep mentioning in a lot of these ink and shading videos, is that a certain level of thought, when applied to your drawing at the beginning and as you move through, and indeed with each mark, will give a sense of realism or style to your piece that you really desire. So I'm going to keep practicing this here. These are going to look a little bit like baguettes or cylinders, but this one, curving the lines in this way, shows that the object is moving away from us. In fact, the back end of this should actually be smaller. Let's see what happens if we do it the opposite way. In fact, the object on the left is not only moving away from us, but it's tilted upward. This object on the right is also moving away from us, but it is tilted downward. And again, if you were to do this more accurately, it would actually be smaller on the end that is furthest away from us. On this one, we get to see what that looks like in a more practical sense when it comes to hatching. And like I said, immediately this looks like a loaf of bread, so we're just gonna kind of lean into that. Shapes that move away from us or toward us, and the particular angle with which they do so, is going to tell us a lot about how to shade that particular object. You can see on this final one, I've actually adapted that and I've made the back end of it smaller because it is slightly further away. It's foreshortened. And this is in reality how things function. If you want to see this in action, go ahead and pause the video and take a pencil or a pen and hold it very, very close to your eyes. And you can stare straight down it and you can see these lines mirrored at each seam on that object. This is another thing that is really good to practice. Something that I got to do a lot of with my robot series. Robots are really good for practicing perspective, foreshortening, and cross contour. Not to mention they're fun and they're low stakes, and I would highly encourage anyone to draw them. For this next shape, I'm going to do something a little bit more complicated, and this again is a really good thing to practice. It's basically just a noodle. I'm not worrying particularly about whether it's getting larger or smaller as it's moving toward me or away from me. That's something that could come in later on in your practice. But at the beginning, it's good just to think about, this is a shape. Where is it coming toward me? Where is it going further away? I'm doing these lines on here to indicate those things. So that line that I just drew an arrow to is where it's actually facing me directly. It's neither moving away from me or toward me. Now it's going to go away from me, invert, come a little bit closer, and then go back again as it moves towards that right tip. On the left side, it's pretty much just going to go away from me. Though we could have that little indent there come back to being flush, and then we could have it go away again. This kind of practice is really good to do, and you will notice pretty quickly if things are not correct. So I would encourage you just to draw a bunch of these funky little noodle snakes and try figuring out where the lines would go on there, the cross contour lines, to show you how that surface is functioning. And again, it's not very high stakes. Like if you mess up, who cares? Not a big deal at all. And the more advanced version of this practice is to actually make the object smaller when it is further away from you. Because again, if you take something that is this shape and put it in that position, the pieces that are close to you will be larger, and the pieces that are moving away from you will be smaller. The last thing I'm going to do here is draw a center line, so you can kind of see this line is consistent throughout the entirety of that object. That would be the top seam, perhaps. And that might just help you wrap your head around it a little bit better. Well, let's see what happens if we take this away from cylindrical rounded shapes into things that are a little bit more geometric. We're going to work with a couple rocks or cubes here. And I think this will give us another and different perspective on how this functions. Again, on some level, these objects are moving away from us. The surfaces that are facing us are a little bit closer, and I'm working in with my pencil here. There is no shame in using a pencil. As I came to this, I was thinking I wanted it to be precise as I'm recording, so I'm like, I'm going to use a pencil to get my lines on there. There is no shame in using a pencil on your ink drawings to plan things out, especially when you're working with waterproof ink like I am here that I can easily come back to later and I can erase. Now this top face of this cube-like object, perhaps this is a rough-hewn stone to build a building. It's a flat surface, and it's also going to be struck by the light, so it's going to be lighter. But as I work on the sides, these faces are going down. Now I could work on this from the exact opposite angle, from a perpendicular angle, and it would work fine as well, as long as I'm being consistent. This implies, however, that that face is moving vertically, and we as humans are able to interpret those joints, those lines, and we understand what that surface is doing. This is something that is really beneficial when you're trying to shade something, when you're trying to use hatching with ink. And even if you're using a ballpoint pen, something that is a little bit variable in the depth of line that you're making, it's still going to function really well. So I've just made sure that those lines there are more dense. The density of them makes them a little bit darker, or at least appear darker. But again, drawing in general is just giving the illusion of something. Over here, we're going to do a very quick example and see what happens if we do things differently. So we're going to approach that front face in a very similar fashion with vertical hatching. We're going to come to that next face. We're just going to heighten that line in, make it a little bit darker so we have a separation. Nothing wrong there. Sometimes that actually happens on boxes. But what happens if we actually use the same manner of hatching on the top flat plane? Well, this doesn't look right, does it? It actually looks like that back face is heading down vertically as well. It looks like it's an open object, like a box of some kind. As I'll demonstrate here really quickly, as I had that same idea. I like to do this when I'm practicing, and I would encourage you to do this as well. Not just the taking notes, but if you think this is the way I'm supposed to do something, but why, then try the opposite, see what happens. You'll often discover really good things in that moment. You'll learn why a particular strategy works. And in some cases, you'll learn that the strategy doesn't matter that much, that you have other options available to you, and maybe options that you find more enjoyable. Let's go on to this more complicated shape here. This is more of just a general stone. So it's going to have surfaces on it that are flat, surfaces that are rough, surfaces that are smooth, surfaces that are curved. And the angles are going to change frequently. I'm again thinking that the light is broadly coming from above, which is important, and the object itself is below our field of vision. Actually, all three of these box-like objects are, right? If we were going to put a horizon line like we did earlier, the horizon line would be above all of these objects, but the same principles are going to apply regardless. Each of these faces is getting hit a little bit differently. And you'll notice this is actually not a bad way to draw a surface like this, because each time I vary the direction of my lines, I am implying that the surface has changed. Even if you're using a pencil for this, if you shade entirely from that one angle for each face, it will naturally imply that that is the breaking of a face, that it looks different. This is difficult. This is for sure the most difficult thing that I have done in this drawing yet. The way to build up your skill to be able to do things like this that are a little bit more difficult, though, is to start very simply with the cube to the left. You start with a standard cube, you get comfortable with that, and then you start thinking about, well, what happens if I take a chunk out of it? What if there's a crack in the side? And you slowly start to modify that object. Most of the world around us is built of cylinders, cones, cubes, pyramids, rectangular boxes. Once you know how to work with those things, you can start interpreting loosely most of the world around you. A tree, for example, is made up of a series of cylinders shoved together. The canopy of a tree is generally a series of kind of smushed overlapping spheres. Once you interpret the world that way, most things become a little bit easier to draw. Well, as always, thanks for listening and watching today. I hope this was beneficial for you. Let me know in the comments below which part was most beneficial or what you would like me to cover next time. I read every comment. I'm very happy to receive them. Have a good one, y'all. See you soon.